Just a quick backstory on myself. My name is Frank Iovine. I was raised in New York City. I became a New York City police officer in the 1980s, and then a detective in the 1990s. So being in law enforcement anywhere is a stressful job. Doesn't make a difference if you're in New York, or if you're in Poland, or if you're in Germany, or in Italy, or in India. It does not make a difference. It's a very stressful job. And as the way my journey unfolded, I would succumb to those stresses. After I retired, I was stressed out, and I had succumbed to, alcohol addiction and very, very dark thoughts, which controlled my life for years. And it wasn't until I made the decision to change my life for a positive outcome that things started to change. And understanding those thoughts was not easy in the beginning. It's a lot easier now, because that's one of the things that I had to understand. Now, also, having felt the effects of dark thoughts and addiction, and then also with colleagues and friends committing suicide, I wanted to be able to start to do something to give back to people. So I ran across something, and it took a little while for it to sink in. So I'm sure everybody here has heard of some version of what they call the 80-20 principle. It's used in business. It's used in a lot of different areas. And what happened is I found that the 80-20 principle also works for the mind. Now, what happened is that as I was doing my research and I was on my journey, and one of the things that I would just put out there is that remembering that our journey is a journey. Our minds, the end result is not a destination. Our whole life is a journey. And as I was able to become more in control of my thoughts and my responses, that journey got easier. So back to where I was. In 2005, the American Scientific Foundation did a study, and they found out that we have between 12 and 60,000 thoughts per day. Now, these thoughts are not all very heavy thoughts. Some of them are very easily, I got to go food shopping, I got to go here. So please remember that these aren't all. But out of those 12 to 60,000 thoughts we have per day, 80% of them are negative. Of that 80%, they can be repetitive, which is a very, very, very difficult thing to keep on happening to us. So now this is where the 80-20 principle comes in. So I was thinking about this study, and I realized, well, this falls in line with the 80-20 principle, because why? Math hasn't changed. If 80% of my thoughts are negative, that means that I have 20% of those thoughts that are positive, that are holding over the 80%. They're keeping back the 80% of negative thoughts. So I really started to dive into this. And as I dove into this, I realized that, and I spoke to a few friends of mine that are engineers. I looked at this in a different way. I realized that if 80% of our thoughts are negative and 20% of our thoughts are positive, that means they have to be made of different materials. If they're not made of different materials, then what will happen is that the 80% would just crush the 20%, right? So in understanding that, I realized that, okay, so I had to figure out what is my 80% made of and what is my 20% made of. So in doing that, what I was able to do is I did an inventory. Now, in a lot of 12-step programs, inventory, that's where I learned how to inventory. And that's how I learned not to be afraid of what I found. Okay. So doing an inventory to find out the main culprits that are driving your negative thoughts. Then from there, going over and looking at what you can then switch those thoughts to on a positive side. So that it proved to be difficult in the beginning, but as time went on, there was little nuggets that were passed on to me, right? And some of those nuggets were this. One of the key things which was given to me was intellect over emotion. So that does not mean that I'm absent of emotion, but I am aware of my emotions. Now, being aware of my emotions means that I can intellectually look at what is going on in front of me, because this is all now stuff that's going on quickly and it's coming on fast. So in understanding that, I realized that my 80% was made up of self-doubt, low self-esteem, fear, which I'll get into in a minute, materialism, then my addiction, and then there are so many other negative thought patterns that are attached to those. Now, I'm sure later on you'll be able to add on to that list. That is just a short list of what's going on. Now, let's just look into fear, because in my life, fear is what drove the rest of everything else. And those fears were of three basic types. The first fear was the fear of not getting what I want. Now, please understand, these fears are not ranked 1, 2, and 3. They're just listed as 1, 2, and 3. So the fear of not getting what I want, the fear of losing something, or the fear of being found out. Now, I found out, and it's funny, I found out that in my life, the fear of being found out is what really ruled my life. The fear. Now, where does that come from? Well, that comes from myself. And what would I want? How do I want to say this? So that comes from me and the stories that I would tell, that I would embellish a little bit. Has anybody ever played that game of telephone in an audience, where you start on this side and you give them a statement, and then by the time it gets to the other side through 15 or 20 people, it's a totally different story? Well, that's what I'm talking about. So embellishment, and then the fear of being found out that I embellished on something. So that is something that drove me. And then the fear of people finding out that I had an addiction. That was another fear of being found out. So all of these fears controlled my thinking, and they controlled my behavior. That is a key thing. So I did an inventory. I found out what my fears are. I found out what my behaviors are. I looked at them. I discussed them with another person. Now, whether you discuss them with a psychiatric person, a clinician, or you discuss them with a priest or a religious or somebody in your community that you can rely on and have a good trust with, that they're going to be able to offer you help. That is the biggest start. The biggest start is actually just going in and starting that conversation. Because one of the things about fear is there are two types of fear. And I'll give a quick little story on this. So if you lived on a desert island, in a fishing village on one side of the island, and you had to go visit your uncle on the other side of the island, and you had to walk through the rainforest. As you're walking through the rainforest, you're going to encounter animals from the rainforest. You're going to encounter snakes, and a whole host of different animals that you might encounter. Your mind can imagine whatever you would like. So the question is what is going to happen when you encounter that animal? So let's just use a snake, right? You're going to do one of two things. You're going to have that fight or flight response. You're either going to pick up a stick, hit the snake, and kill it. You're not going to check to see if it's poisonous. Or you're going to turn and run, and your body is going to send adrenaline to your legs and cortisol and all of those superhuman enzymes to get your body to run away as fast as it can. So with that is the appropriate use of fear. Your body will get a sensation. You will realize that something is not correct. And from there, you will move on and take one of those two choices. Now, here's the difference. If the night before you go to bed, you're thinking about the encounter with the snake, which might or might not happen, you then take fear into a different level. And the fear becomes a very, very high level. And that is what they call anxiety, which is totally different than what fear was given to us for the reason of keeping us safe, right? So now let's just look at the negative thoughts and why. So we do need that fear because that fear keeps us safe. Now, that's a very, very simple way of understanding it. So now we look at the 20%. We go back to that equation. What is in our 20%? So in our 20%, we have any of the virtues that you might be familiar with. In my use, I use gratitude, and I use amore fati, which is a Stoic philosophy, a part of Stoic philosophy, which started in looking at loving your fate of what happens to you today. So you have humility, esteemable acts, compassion, confidence. These are all choices. Now, there are a list of more. We could keep on going of different ones, but I'm sure if we take the two, you will most likely see that the 80%, you'll find more ease in doing the 80% than the 20%. And that's another common equation or a common problem that we all come into. That's in my life, that's when intellect over emotion helps me. That is a very, very simple equation that I can use to make sure that my responses to each and every situation is the correct or within the realm of the 20%. To me, that's paramount. Now, what are some examples of 20%? Meaning, what can we do to gain those 20%, to move up that 20% to say 30%, to 40%? That's when our lives really start to change. That's when my life really started to change. When I went from, and I switched the equation, and I started moving up my positive thoughts, my positive thinking, my positive acts. Now, one of the things which I found works very, very well is esteemable acts. So, what is an esteemable act? Well, it's doing for somebody else when you would prefer to do something for you. So what would that mean? That would mean taking the time to help a stranger that you realize needs help. That would mean going volunteering at a soup kitchen. That would mean not donating money. What it truly means is donating of yourself. And I started doing esteemable acts as time goes, as my life grows, and I still do them to this day. As time permits, and as my mind, when something speaks to me, that is what I will get involved with, and then put in some of my efforts to see how I can help. So I mentioned the Stoics. Now, Stoic philosophy is a big part of my 20%, because I can sit there and just say, yeah, sure, take the 20% and figure it out. That is a very, very difficult task. We all need a guiding life philosophy. Now, whether that philosophy falls into a spiritual axiom, whatever your spiritual thoughts are, or if it falls into a philosophical area. Mine fell into the philosophical area. Now, I'm going to read some quotes, and just to get your mind flowing, because it is early in the morning in the United States. If you're over in Europe, you're ahead of us a couple of hours. So Stoic philosophy started a little bit over 2,500 years ago. It was invented by Zeno from Citium. So Stoic philosophy was a way to understand our responses and make sure that our responses are correct, and that it's our response is the only thing we have control over. That's where it now, Zeno was a follower of Socrates, and he took some other of the early Greek philosophical schools, and he blended it all into one. And what he ended up with is Stoic philosophy. Now, the meaning of Stoic philosophy does not mean the typical definition of Stoic, meaning somebody that is absent of emotion. That is not what Stoic philosophy brings into life. What Stoic philosophy brings into life is a way for you to highlight joy and find tranquility and not to let negative thoughts, negative thinkings, or negative emotions come in and affect you. That is the basic rule of the way Stoic philosophy works and what it is meant to do. So the first quote is Marcus Aurelius was somebody that I started to follow and I started to identify with. And why? Well, Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome. And he wrote a book called The Meditations. The Meditations is his way of understanding his thoughts and his actions, his behaviors, and how, whether they were in tune or not in tune with being a good human being. Now, one of the things which really blew my mind is this next fact. Marcus Aurelius studied the teachings of a gentleman called Epictetus. Now, Epictetus was a freed slave. So let's just take a moment to think about that. You have the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, studying and practicing in his life the teachings from a free slave. That, even when I think about it now, it's very difficult for me to wrap my head around. Now, there are people that would say, well, Marcus Aurelius did this and Marcus Aurelius did that. Do we know, or do those people look into all of the good things that Marcus Aurelius did? No, because in life, we always look at the negative. So let's just look at one of Marcus Aurelius's quotes. Such as are your habitual thoughts, so also will be the character of your mind. For the soul is dyed by its thoughts. Dye it then with continuous series of such thoughts as these. For instance, that where a man can live, there he can also live well. In taking that quote, now there are a lot of different versions of that quote. There's our souls are dyed by the color of our thoughts. Again, that to me ties into the 80-20 principle. That ties into that if the majority of my thoughts are negative, then that is what is going to rule my inner feelings. Those feelings that we all have that run up and down our chest, that are triggered by so many different things. Now, remember that our emotions are real. Our emotions are chemicals that the brain transmits so the body can understand what the mind is thinking. It's a very powerful, powerful understanding. That's why people are addicted to rage, because the body releases certain neuropeptides, which then create a greater feeling that the body then becomes addicted to. So, in regards to that other quote, there's also the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. So, in looking at these two quotes, we see that it falls right in line with the 80-20. It falls right in line with looking at my thoughts, looking at my emotions, and finding out which ones are appropriate, which ones are not appropriate, then finding the corresponding emotion and or thought to either negate that one and make it even, or to even downplay it, to get it to realize that it is not an appropriate thing. Now, I will give you something that just happened to me recently. So I recently had the pleasure of traveling to India to speak at an ashram for a gentleman that it was a contemporary of Gandhi. And his name was Rokashat. I'm forgetting the second half of his name. I will get it. Apologies on that. So when we spoke at this ashram, and understanding what this man's writings was about. One of the things that he stated was that humanity is my religion. So when I was in India, I had the time to meet with local and regular people. Now, what was amazing is there was over 500,000 people at this event, this celebration of this man's life. And these people came from all walks of life. They came from the highest caste in the Indian system to the lowest caste. And they were all there to forward this man's teachings on how to live a life in a village. Seeing all of these people come together in a fashion of organization and oneness and giving touched me in a place that I just could not believe, because you do not get to see that over here. I've never seen that in the United States. It was an amazing experience. So with that, I will move on. It gave me, so the example, I'm sorry, I got dragged off. So the example that I had, what happened to me is I started to get into that fear. That fear started to take over. What happens if I stutter on my words as I'm doing my talk? What happens if I misread? What happens if this? And what I was able to understand, which is two things. One, if I practice, I will be able to go through it. I realized intellectually, I had to look at everything intellectually. And two, I realized that I was in this situation for a reason. Now, whether this reason was for me to learn, to better myself, and or to share my knowledge, it didn't make a difference. The point is I was in India, and a couple of days before, I was in the United States. It was an amazing journey and an amazing experience for me to be able to participate in this event. Now, like this event that we're participating in now is another way that I am honored to be able to be here and give you some of the nuggets that I've learned and been able to use in my life. So, in adding the 20%, awareness and action are the key things. Now, I found in the beginning, being aware of my negative thought patterns and my negative behaviors, which I had, was not very uplifting. I found that I was selfish. I was self-centered. Anger would come out of me. And what I did is when I wrote out my list of my top behaviors that affected me. I slowly, one by one, worked on each one. So what did I do? I started with action. I started taking action on my anger. One of my biggest ones was impatience. I was a very, very impatient person, which goes to not getting what I want, right? The fear of not getting what I want. I want what I want, and I want it right now. I don't want it in 5 minutes. I don't want it in 3 minutes. I want it exactly now. So what could I do to learn patience? How could I teach myself? So, of course, I thought of some ideas and they didn't work so well. So I had to enlist the help of some other people. So I asked some people that I knew, and they said, well, what is patience? Patience is the ability to wait quietly, right? It's to wait in quiet. So where can you do that? Where can you wait quietly? Well, it's a little difficult, but the best place that I found was the supermarket. So what I would do is when I went to the supermarket, you know how most people sit there and they look for the shortest line, and they want to get into the shortest line so that they can buy what they want and they can get the hell out of the supermarket so that they can get home and start doing what they were doing at home. Well, instead of looking for the shortest line, I would look for the longest line, and I would wait. And then I would observe the other people around me and try to pick up on some of their traits, or look at what other people were buying, just to see where other people were in their journey of life. And for me, it's really what taught me patience, is getting on the longest line in the supermarket. I know a lot of people might sit there and say you're a little crazy. There are people who told me that. But to me, that is where I started to learn patience. So what else? That's action. So in understanding action, what else can we do in the aspect of taking action? One of the things we can do for action is, once you find your negative counterparts, the negative thoughts and behaviors, just find what would be opposite and then do the opposite. All right? What I would say is, I would go back to Marcus Aurelius, and it's not a principle, it's a state of mind that I'm trying to get to. So what I would do is, when I feel myself being agitated, which is going to happen, I'm a human being like everybody else. If I'm waiting in line at the airport and I want to get through security so that I can get through, it's being aware that my thoughts aren't harmful. They're just thoughts. Now, I got that through the understanding of a lot of the Stoic principles, which is the 3 main Stoic areas, which is your relationship with nature, your relationship with others, and your relationship with yourself. So in looking at those 3 relationships as I'm going through life, I can then bring myself back to a point of, where am I? What am I doing? Is this thought actually here? So I I have to steal something from that's one of the things about my stoicism. So there are times when I need a quick jolt. So to keep myself in key is the understanding. Marcus Aurelius talks about this. He talks about that when you get knocked out of tune, the best thing to do is to get right back up. And the quicker you can get yourself and realize that you're out of tune. And how do I do that? Intellect over emotion. So there are two quotes that were taught to me, and they fall in line with some of Marcus Aurelius's teaching. Marcus Aurelius taught that, how does this thought make me behave? So that is the one that's always hanging in the back of my head. When I feel a negative thought or feeling coming up, which I think we all know when they're coming up, I go to, all right, how is this thought, how is this reaction going to make me behave? So there's two questions that I can ask myself. One question is this: how does this thought is this thought useful? Yes or no? Is this thought useful? How does this thought make me behave? Like a child? Like an adult? Like an angry dog? Those are the two things that will bring me right back to intellect over emotion. Because then I can look at it intellectually and say, no, Frank, that's not an appropriate thought. That's not an appropriate behavior to do. No, we don't want to curse that guy out who just cut you off on the highway. And that's another teaching. So then what happens in my mind is all of the small little pieces of all of the information I've read from all the Stoics start flooding my mind. And I go, okay, all right, okay, I got you. It's like they're all talking to me at once, and I understand them all. Like there's a quote from Seneca where Seneca talks about he's doing an inventory, because the Stoics were big on inventories. So he's doing a nightly inventory, and he was invited to a party earlier that day, and he realized that he was upset and mad. So when he got home that night, and the reason he was upset and mad, it was because he was not seated in where he thought he should have been seated at the dinner, at the event. Now, for people that don't know Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. So he was a person of high ranking. So he should have, some of the best seats, so to speak. So what happened was when he got home, he realized that he had a resentment. He realized he was upset at the hosts of the party and the people that were sitting in the chair that he thought he should be sitting in. So what did he have to do? He had to get rid of the resentment. And what he did is he said to himself, you dum-dum, what does it matter where you put your weight on the couch? It's just, so a lot of times it's just extracting out a very, very, very simple, not antidote, but a very, very simple thought process that tells you or tells me that my thinking was wrong. Thoughts is that most men don't have a fear of death, they have a fear of living. And it's a very, very true statement. So one of the other things which I do to help with my mind, because my mind will go back to different areas. That's why part of this is mind mastery, is understanding and mastering your mind, your thoughts, right? Is this: I am constantly looking for little tells in no matter where I am, in music and other people speaking, and in anywhere that I can, in nature. And for me, nature is the outside universe. So it's everything. It's when I'm at the supermarket, it's anything outside of me where it could be permissible that I could learn something from somebody else. So humility is a big part. But what I want to get to, there's a song by an artist by the name of Ren, and that is REN. Amazing, amazing artist, has some really, really groundbreaking thought patterns and stories in his songs. But one of his lines in the song called Humble is that I make friends with my pain because my pain keeps me humble. And to me, that is an amazing, amazing idea. I never thought of it. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. Let me see what has injured me emotionally, where I've been in pain, and then make friends with it. And then try to understand it, because it keeps me humble, shows me that I'm a human being. And also, it gives me the ability to have more compassion and empathy for others. Because, well, if I've gone through this, then that person might be going through it right now. So what can I do? I can just sit there and wait.